The next item on our agenda today is to take evidence on the cost effectiveness of Scottish public inquiries. This is our second evidence session, and I therefore welcome to the meeting the Right Honourable Lord Hardy, former Chair of the Edinburgh Tram Inquiry, and Dr Emma Ayrton, Associate Professor, Nottingham Law School, Nottingham University. And we're going to go straight to questions because there is so much really to kind of dig in here. And if we actually think about what you've said, Lord Hardy, you've talked about one of the issues about this inquiry is that, the inquiry that we're doing into inquiries is that one of the things that public inquiries often do is reinvent the wheel. So I'm just wondering if you can talk us to us a wee bit about your concerns in terms of that.
Well, it's really in relation to the setting up of the inquiry. What happens what happened in my case was that the then First Minister had approached me through the Lord Advocate and the solicitor to the Scottish Government to inquire if I would be interested or be prepared to do the inquiry. And when I said I would, there was then discussion about the terms of reference. And then the announcement was made in Parliament in which the then First Minister referred to being, I think, a swift and thorough inquiry, raising expectations that it would be determined quickly without any knowledge on either of our parts as to what was involved, how many documents, how many witnesses, what have you. But I think the expectation also was that immediately after that, I would walk into an office which was fully equipped and fully staffed and start work. Well, I did start work, but the work was finding an office. And when we found an office, it was one that the government was already paying rent for, but was unused. So it seemed to me to be, it was also a good location. It was near the station for witnesses. So it seemed to me to be ideal. It had portals in the floor for IT and what have you, so the assumption was that everything was hunky-dory, as it were. But once we got started, it became clear that the IT system didn't work, and we had to rely upon Creative Scotland, who were the original tenants, to assist us with IT. And then we decided, or it was considered essential, that we had our own IT system. And the report sets out various attempts by Vodafone to install a cable. I think they had three attempts before they got a cable. And in the meantime, they had installed the internal cabinet. But without the cable, the effect of installing the internal cabinet was that we were cut off from the original system of Creative Scotland, and we had to have temporary devices which kept crashing. So we had about 6 months of frustration on the part of the staff and us, and obviously a waste of money. But so really what I'm advocating is that when an inquiry is set up, there should, or just before it's set up, there should be a department within, I suggested within the Justice Department, which deals with inquiries, which has the necessary accommodation or access to accommodation. It knows what accommodation is available within the public sector, and if there isn't enough in the public sector, it goes out to the private sector, as some inquiries do, and it's identified the accommodation. It's satisfied itself that the IT systems in place are adequate for the task of the inquiry, and it gives guidance to the Secretary as to what he or she has to do to establish the administration. Now, what in fact happens is that each time there's an inquiry, the chair has to start from scratch. And that is a waste of money. It's a waste of experience, because each chair, unless he or she has conducted an inquiry previously, has no experience of setting up an inquiry. Now, I note that I think I mentioned that in the 2014 report in the House of Lords about public inquiries, they made a similar recommendation. But from the 2024 report, it's clear that the government didn't accept that, and said that the reason for that was that the reason for rejecting it was there weren't enough public inquiries to justify that. But what they did do is they set up a unit within the Cabinet Office which performs at least some of these functions. I would still advocate it being within the Justice Department, because even if there isn't enough work to keep civil servants occupied all of the time on that, they can have other functions within the Justice Department, so that when an inquiry is set up, it's a bit like the police. My son-in-law is a police officer, and he had a ticket for public order issues. So if a public order issue arose, then the phone call went out around different police stations, picking out officers to form to rally at particular points and to get kitted up. So you could have within the Justice Department, you could have different officials in different departments. So you're not actually having one department working all together. You have one in this department, one in that, and then when the inquiries are about to set up, the whistle goes, and these people are then seconded into this unit to set up. Sorry?
Dr. Ireton.
Oh, sorry.
I think there's two aspects you need to think about reinventing the wheel. It is absolutely an issue in terms of the setting up of an inquiry from scratch, the administration, the IT, the logistics and so forth. But also every time an inquiry is set up, it's starting again in terms of procedure. So the cost of an inquiry is not only the logistics and the administrative side of how it's run, but it's the procedural way in which an inquiry is run. And in the same way that many chairs don't have experience of setting up inquiries, they don't have experience of running inquiries, either in the procedure. And the situation we have currently is inquiries are set up, they complete their task, they cease to exist, and a lot of the institutional knowledge in terms of the way that they are run is lost. And what we don't have is a central repository of best practice in terms of the way in which inquiries are run. Now, there is the Inquiries and Investigations team in the Cabinet Office, and they are a small team, they have a very important role, and they support secretaries to the inquiry in terms of some of these logistics. But they don't have the resources or the funding currently to capture lessons learned in terms of the way inquiries are run, what's worked well, what's learnt less well, to create a repository of information to inform decisions of future inquiries. So what isn't available currently is when there's a new inquiry and a chair is appointed, there is no induction, there is no talk about how different inquiries are to other processes. There's no information available in terms of informing them so they can see what's been done in the past, what worked, what might work well on our inquiry. Now, every inquiry is different, and it's very important that every chair has the flexibility to determine the most appropriate procedure. So I'm not suggesting there should be prescriptive guidance, but the availability of that bank of information to draw on and inform those decisions in terms of cost efficiency and effectiveness of an inquiry is not there currently and is really needed.
I mean, one of the issues actually, in fact, the reason we're having this look at public inquiries in terms of the costs is because the costs do seem to be astronomical. Not only is the time scale often run away from people, and there's a concern that mean, justice has to be not only done, but seen to be done. And if inquiries take 5, 10 years, even longer on some occasions, there's an issue about that. Now, I know one of the issues that you've raised, Lord Hardy, is the fact that if you put a specific budgetary limit on an inquiry, you've said that that approach might undermine public confidence in the inquiry. But surely every other area of public life has a set budget at which it has to operate to, and indeed a timescale. And while parameters can, there can be a bit an element of flexibility. Surely, while you're concerned that public confidence might erode if there's limits set, surely public confidence is eroded if public inquiries just seem to go on and on and on year after year. People think 1, 2, 3 years, and then 5, 6, 7, 8 years they're still waiting for an outcome.
Yes, well, I understand that, Chair, but I think excuse me. I think if you're going to indicate or set a budget and a timescale for every inquiry, it has to be an informed decision. And the problem is that at the outset, nobody knows what is involved. The First Minister didn't know, I didn't know. Indeed, I was speaking to Dr. Edmonds before we sat down, that when I came in, when it started and we had the Secretary in place, and that's another thing about delay. Once you appoint a civil servant as the Secretary, and there's a time lapse because he or she has to be transferred from the department, and the department doesn't readily give up civil servants, particularly when they're not being replaced. So there's that time lapse as well. But once the Secretary was in place, one of the early things that I asked her to do was to meet with the interested parties, possibly who would become corporate participants, people who would be involved in the project, and ascertain the number of documents that each of them had. And the first report, she came back to me and said, oh, it seems to be about 2 million. And I said, no, if you go back again and ask the question and say that we don't accept that. It then came back at 20 million. And I said, no, go back. And she came back, and the final figure was 500 million documents. Now that, of course, was unmanageable. Nobody can manage that. So we then had to devise a strategy, and we whittled that down to 3 million into a database. And then for the inquiry, I think we used about 17,000 of the documents. But the point was, in whittling down the large number, there's a risk that you're missing something. So we told the core participants that if they thought there were documents of relevance, then they had to submit them. So it'd be impossible, until you know what you're dealing with, it's not possible to fix a budget. It's totally unrealistic. And nor is it possible to fix a timescale. So that these are issues that have to be addressed if you're going to fix a budget. I'm not against fixing a budget, but if you had fixed a budget of £5 or £6 million without knowing that that's what you're dealing with, there's no way that you're going to deliver that. And having built up the expectation of the public that they would get that for £5 million within 3 years, then the media and the public start complaining.
I think that there's a kind of, they're wildly optimistic when they set out inquiries as to what the timescale and cost would be, because I've never seen an inquiry, or very few, that come in even approximating to what's initially budgeted for in either time or funding. And yet we see in other areas, other jurisdictions, that doesn't seem to be the case. So, for example, Australia, which I don't think is wildly different from Scotland as a country, they had a COVID inquiry that began in September 2023, finished 13 months later and cost £4 million. whereas, for example, the UK's is well over 160 million already and has been going on for 4 years, and the Scotland's 34 million and has been on for 3.5 years. So surely there's something we can learn from elsewhere in terms of how we can deliver these more effectively, more efficiently, and less debilitating in terms of the impact on the taxpayer.
Yes, of course I accept that.
So sorry, this is the Dr.
Oh, sorry, I thought...
Yes.
Yes.
I think there's 2 points we're looking at here, and they are different points. So the first, in terms of costs and budgeting, there is no transparency in terms of how the costs are calculated and how it's estimated in terms of how long an inquiry is going to take. But what I do know is there is no consistency currently at all between how inquiries are recording their costs. So there's no meaningful way to do the comparison and come up with accurate estimates. So that's the first point. So being too precise, you're setting up an inquiry against sometimes a figure almost pulled out of the air in terms of the data that you've got to work with. I think a much more important point, and the difference between other jurisdictions, comes down to the focus, and I think this is the key thing, the way in which an inquiry is set up. So in other jurisdictions, there is a clearer focus on what the purpose of an individual inquiry is for. We've had this in the past, but it's been drifting and we've had massive mission creep. So if I could explain it in terms of, if, for example, the subject matter of an inquiry was a tragedy, a boating disaster, you could have a very forensic inquiry that looks into the past at the incident and works out what happened, what went wrong, on what dates, who was there, the details of what went wrong to prevent that occurring again. You could have a policy inquiry, a higher macro level inquiry, where there have been a number of similar incidents, and you're looking at the macro level in terms of what went wrong in the checks and balances, what are the systemic failures in administration and regulation that enabled these disasters to keep occurring. So that's the high level. And that, to me, should be the primary purpose of inquiries. There's also the truth-telling inquiries. We have less of them in this jurisdiction, but there are more in other jurisdictions, for example, Australia and South Africa, where it's more looking, so to use the example of the boating disasters, if you'd had a series of disasters historically that were caused by past practices and systemic failure, and it is to acknowledge past wrongs, to correct records, to correct the historical records and create testimonies and societal learning. That's the truth-telling. Now, increasingly over time in the UK, if you ask the public participants, a lot of members of Parliament and so forth, what an inquiry does in the UK, they will say all of them. So if you're going to have inquiries that are very forensic and look at the systemic macro failings and produce the records of testimonies of what went wrong, it's inevitable. You are always going to have very long, expensive inquiries. And that's why ours are different. We're not comparing like with like. When we look overseas and say, well, they've done that differently, it's cheaper. If you look at the inquiries, they're either forensic inquiries to understand what went wrong, or they're systemic to inform policy reform, or they're the truth-telling inquiries.
What are the differences?
The outcomes are very different. Do you want to know, do you want a past-looking inquiry that understands the detail of what went wrong? Is it sufficient to recognise these things have gone wrong, but what went wrong in the checks and balances? So what you're getting in the policy one is recommendations to inform government decisions going forwards. How do we change those checks and balances to make sure this does not happen again? So in the first one, looking at the detail of the incident, how do we stop this incident happening again? The second one, the checks and balances. How do we change policy to prevent this occurring? The third one, what you're getting is you're correcting the historical record, you're acknowledging past wrongs. A lot of it, for example, in Australia is First Nations inquiries and so forth, when you're correcting the public record. So a decision has to be made. What is the inquiry for? And how much are we prepared to invest in terms of time and cost to achieve the outcome? And so if you want a cheaper, more efficient, cost-effective inquiry, you decide what the priority is. Now, all inquiries do all of those. So to be clear, every inquiry will have elements of forensic investigation and truth-telling and policy. But it's what is the core focus and the purpose. And just to be clear as well, the core participants, the survivors, the bereaved and so forth, are central to all of those. So I'm not saying there's a difference. They are central to informing a forensic inquiry in terms of what went wrong because they have the knowledge.
But in terms of the people for whom an inquiry is often established on behalf of, because they're looking for justice because there's a perception that they've not received that, how is it received differently in other jurisdictions? I mean, because my understanding here in terms of inquiries is if an inquiry drones on 5 or 10 years, then the initial kind of impetus is lost. And we then have a situation often, as you'll be well aware, that once an inquiry report is delivered, the government of the day, whether it's UK or Scottish government, may then agree to implement, a host of recommendations. And then a year or two later, 5 years later, a proportion at best of these recommendations may have been implemented and many will not have been. So there surely must be an element of frustration that is taking years, it's cost a fortune, and there may not necessarily be a better outcome. Or is there a better outcome in your view than these inquiries which have cost less, been punchier, been delivered in a time scale that for most normal people, if you like, most lay people think is realistic? If you say to someone, if someone says, I'm really keen on a public inquiry to look at X, Y, Z, and they say, well, okay, in 5 or 10 years we might have a result for you. I mean, people don't anticipate that. Even though inquiries do drag on for years, people don't think that when they're going to start. They all think a public inquiry is going to come up with an answer next year, maybe, or the year after. And they don't. And so how do these shorter inquiries, for example, do they deliver? Or in the Australian one, which concluded, in COVID 4 years ago, are the people, is there still a level of dissatisfaction, or are people put that to bed and moved on with their lives? Do you get what I'm trying to say here?
Yes,
what are we getting for the difference?
There's a lot of different things in there. So what I would say is, within the UK, Scotland inquiries, we have lost focus more on what inquiries are than in other jurisdictions. There is a better understanding in other jurisdictions. When an inquiry is convened, you will see from the press, from the statements and so forth, there is a clearer understanding. This inquiry is to inform policy reform. This inquiry is to change policy to make sure that this doesn't happen again. Or this is a forensic inquiry to get answers to what went wrong so that we can understand. Or this is to correct the public record. So there is a better understanding. We have created a problem that you don't see in the same scale elsewhere because we are expecting inquiries to do all those things. And also, on top of that, we're placing justice, redress, accountability, catharsis. Now, to come back on some of the points that you raised, you mentioned, what about those for whom the inquiry is convened for? Well, it isn't. A public inquiry is to address a matter of public concern, and it is the role of the government to address matters of public concern.
But it's often because they're pressed by members of the public who feel they have been wronged with a specific incident
Absolutely.
or series of incidents. So that's what
Absolutely.
I was meaning by that. I understand the wider picture.
Yeah, it's
the people who are directly affected who are the ones who press for it.
It is about them, absolutely, and they're the ones that end up having to push for these inquiries. But it's about them, not for them. And there are all sorts of reasons why ours have lost focus and got complicated, and that's one of them. We talk about the survivors and the bereaved as if they're a single homogenous group, and they're not. Some of them want very detailed answers. Some of them want a quick inquiry to make changes so that no other family has to go through what they've gone through. Others really want the public record corrected. Okay. There is never consensus in any jurisdiction over what an inquiry should be, because these all conflict. And a decision has to be made at the very beginning by the minister, looking at all these balancing competing interests. In this situation, what is needed from this inquiry? What do we need as the government to inform us going forward to address this matter of public concern. What is most pressing? So either you say all of those things and you accept that you're going to have massive inquiries that probably by the time they report it's too late to bring about meaningful change, or you've had repeated incidents and so forth. Or you accept that decisions need to be made, and some people will be disappointed and some people will be happy. There will always be that. There is in other jurisdictions. In Australia, when they convene an inquiry, a policy inquiry, a quick one to inform policy, there will be people pushing to say, no, we need answers. And they're not wrong. I'm not saying any of these views are wrong. They're all absolutely justifiable, but they conflict, and so a decision has to be made. What is the purpose of this inquiry going to be? And off the back of that decision, everything else is affected from then onwards. You can't convene a huge inquiry to deal with everything and then say, but we want it completed in 2 years.
Okay, I'm going to let colleagues in a wee second because everyone's keen to come in. But I just one further question to yourself, Lord Hardy, in the meantime. I mean, one of the things that you've said is that a direction advising participants to be no opening statements, avoiding extra time at public hearings as well as the time and effort by legal representatives could save both time and money. Can you explain why that's such a lengthy process and such a costly process that it impacts on an inquiry?
Well, it's alien to Scotland for a start, but it's what happens mainly in England in court proceedings. And as I understand it, the interested parties would decide what their position was, and they would then involve solicitors and counsel on preparing an opening statement, which could last half a day or a day sometimes, depending on what they're talking about. So that it is an expensive exercise, because when you're talking about costs of inquiries, you've got to be reminded that the cost that the government pay to the chair and all the officials of the inquiry isn't the total cost of the inquiry, because you've got core participants. In this case, I see that the City of Edinburgh was a core, in my case, they say that they spent £2 million on their representation. There would be similar, probably more for the contractors, more for the designers of the operating systems and what have you. So each of these people, if you had opening statements, would spend probably weeks preparing for their opening statement to present their case in the best light, as it were, at the opening of the inquiry. But if you look at the Scottish rules, Rule 10 gives the chair a discretion as to whether there should be opening statements. And I've said that, I issued a notice fairly early on that there wouldn't be any opening statements, not even by counsel to the inquiry, that we would go straight into the evidence. And if you look at the Scottish rules, I think Rule 10 gives the discretion. But if you look at the English rule, the UK rule, the 2006 rule, it doesn't give the chair. So in England, it's mandatory for everybody to have their shot at an opening statement. And to my mind, it's a waste of time, a waste of money, because in an inquisitorial position, it's for the chair to investigate and to indicate what evidence he's interested in to satisfy his remit.
That's very interesting. I mean, I said that was the last question, but I did actually mean to follow on with this one, which is about maximisation. The issue whereby maximisation process, Rule 12, Rule 12.7 prohibits the inclusion of any criticism of a person unless the chair has sent that person a warning letter and the person has been given a reasonable opportunity to respond to the warning letter. This process takes a considerable amount of time. I mean, how long does it? How long would that take? I mean, surely, for those of us in the real world, one would have thought days, possibly weeks. But I get the impression that's not the case.
No, it's not. First of all, what you have to do is you have to identify in the draft final report what it is. You know who you're criticising, but you've then got to, the criticism isn't all in one page or in one chapter. The criticism will be threaded through the report in certain cases, because if you're dealing with one topic, you may be criticising individual A. If you're dealing with another topic, individual A might come up again, and so you're criticising him or her. And so you have to go through the report, you have to know who you're criticising, which is quite easy. But then you have to go through the report and identify all the points of criticism. And then you write to the individual and you have to give him or her adequate time to respond, because you're dealing with their reputation and they have to be given a fair opportunity to respond. So you maybe allow a month or even 2 months, depending on the extent of it. Then it comes back with their views or their comments, and you have to consider that. As I indicated in my note, the responses that I got were substantial, and one in particular was over several hundred pages long. Now, so if you're going to do justice, I mean, that's what you could say, I suppose, is, oh, well, that's fine. We'll just carry on with it as it is. But what you find you can do, or you may do, is you can maybe adjust another part of the report to reflect one of the concerns of the individual, but still leave a criticism of him or her. So it does take a long time. Now, I notice I think it's Mr. Mallon's response, he spoke about the problem about maximisation. And since I wrote my note, I've looked at the 2024 House of Lords report, and it's got a table at the back. And what they seem to be saying in 2024 is it's unnecessary to alter the warning letters, because they had evidence that there were they had evidence as to how improvements to the warning letter process are possible within the existing rules. Now that unfortunately I just read that last night, so I haven't had time to identify the evidence that was before the committee. But if that's so, and I've no reason to doubt that it is, if there is evidence as to how changes, how you can use the rules without contravening or use the rules more effectively, without contravening the right of an individual to comment in advance, then I think that should be explored. And it may be that some of the researchers to the department could find out what the evidence was.
Dr. Ayrton?
Yes, that isn't quite right, actually. The way the rules are drafted currently is it makes it mandatory to serve warning letters if you're going to criticise within the report. And that's the problem. The only change that needs to be made is it needs to be discretionary rather than mandatory. And you need to look further back to understand what the problem is. So everybody is in agreement in terms of common law duties of fairness. People need to have the opportunity to respond when criticisms are put to them. But inquiries have evolved, the sort of two approaches to inquiries have evolved in parallel. And this comes back to my point why we need a centre that understands what's going on in inquiries and shares that learning. So warning letters are not the only way to put that evidence to witnesses. So we have two kinds of inquiries. The more inquisitorial inquiries take the evidence themselves. They put adverse evidence to the witnesses when they take that evidence. If something new comes up, they can take a supplemental statement. They put it to them in terms of during the oral hearings. So in those cases, it is often entirely unnecessary to send everybody warning letters, and it adds months and millions of pounds unnecessarily to inquiries. And you'll get a number of inquiry chairs who have given evidence to that effect. They were forced to follow a process that had no purpose, created work, wasted money. You have other inquiries, and what seems to have happened is to reduce the initial cost to the inquiry and cut back the inquiry team slightly. They have pushed out gathering evidence to participants and to the witnesses. So they're saying, give us evidence that you've got. So that then becomes adversarial. You're immediately in a position where the witnesses are telling you what they want to say, not necessarily what the inquiry wants and needs to have. And you get quite patchy evidence. And it can ultimately be much more expensive because you have to go back and fill the gaps and fill the gaps, and in which case you would need to send warning letters to everybody to make sure that everybody has had the chance to respond. So there are certain circumstances where it's right that everybody gets a warning letter because of the way that inquiry has operated all the way, but other times it's an absolute waste of time, and by simply making it discretionary, those chairs that say we have no need for this simply wouldn't have to follow that process.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to open up the session. List to follow by Michelle.
Thank you. Just on the basis of the very interesting comments that you've just mentioned, Dr. Ireton, do you feel that there is a case for a judge-led inquiry in order to ensure that there is public trust?
I think it depends on the subject matter and on the focus of the inquiry and what it needs to do. So I don't think there's a single answer as to whether it should be judges or not judges.
So what criteria would you use in deciding that it should be judge-led?
Two ways of looking at this. Firstly, if you've got a more forensic inquiry or very huge volumes of information and it plays to the skill set that judges have, it can be appropriate. If you have a more policy-focused inquiry, it will often be better to have an expert in the subject matter and in terms of implementation policy changes. I also think it makes a big difference about the individual as well. Inquiries are very different processes. They require people to approach it in an innovative way, to recognise it's a different sort of process that aren't just going to automatically bring their previous experience to them. It is a much more team-based working, so you want people who work well in a team. So it's about selecting the right person as well. So sometimes that might be a judge because it's the right person in terms of personality and skill set and so forth, and sometimes it may not be.
So in your experience, that's a discussion that will be had between, well, in this case, with the Scottish Government and a proposed chair?
Yes, yeah. And I think more thought needs to be given at the point of appointing a chair in terms of the individual as well as whether it's just a judge or not a judge, but in terms of how they're going to fit within that type of process.
That's very helpful. Lord Hardy, could I ask you about the terms of reference situation? Because obviously the terms of reference in any public inquiry are a matter primarily for the Scottish Government to decide. And in some inquiries, those affected by the inquiry, plus obviously the chair of the inquiry and his team, will have input to what these terms of reference are. We've had 3 inquiries, I think I'm right in saying, the Penrose, the child abuse and the COVID one, where the terms of reference have changed over time. And that's because certain evidence has come out and there's a case for making a change. Do you feel that we're in a situation where, because of the difficulties in some public inquiries, we often have the pressure to change the terms of reference?
Well, I'm aware of some inquiries where there have been attempts to extend the terms of reference. It didn't happen in the tram inquiry. But I think it's important to get the terms of reference right at the beginning. And that's a matter, I think, for discussion between the government and the chair who's about to be appointed. when I was about to be appointed, I was told what the terms, or I was given the draft terms of reference, and that was the indication of what the government were looking for. I think I suggested a minor adjustment to that, and that they remained like that. So I'm aware, for instance, in the Sheikhoud Bayou inquiry, there was a request to extend the terms of reference, which the Minister refused. And I can see that in that inquiry, it was clear what was being sought was to find out what happened and who, if anybody, was responsible.
But if there is evidence that comes to the inquiry that was obviously not foreseen, do you think it's an appropriate process to change the term or to extend or modify the terms of reference that allows that evidence to become quite a critical part of the inquiry?
Well, if the evidence came in, it's presumably coming in because the chair has indicated that he or she is interested to hear it. And once they've heard it, then it can form part of the report. So, it's difficult to see how having allowed it in, you simply ignore it, or you then try to accommodate it by saying, well, I've heard that evidence, oh dear, it's not within my terms of reference. That should have been a process that had gone through the chair's mind before he allowed it.
But just to be absolutely clear, if that situation does arise where there is evidence forthcoming that wasn't foreseen at the start, am I correct in thinking that it's for the chair to have to go back to the Scottish Government for any amendment or adjustment to the terms of reference?
Yes, no, it would be for the chair to do that. And part of the difficulty of that is that what happens now that you've extended the terms of reference, does that open the floodgates for another chapter of evidence that you really hadn't anticipated? So you then set your inquiry team out to see if there are any other piece of evidence within that extended terms of reference, which of course will extend your term to the time of your inquiry.
And just before I ask this question, may I put on the public record that I'm very involved in the Eljamel inquiry in terms of my own casework being submitted. If it transpires through the inquiry that other jurisdictions may have some influence on determining what evidence is relevant and what might apply, how would that be taken on board by the chair of the inquiry in Scotland in relation to the discussions with the Scottish Government?
What do you mean?
If it was the case that these the terms of reference have proven not to be sufficient to allow evidence from another jurisdiction to be taken into consideration, is that a matter that then has to come back to the chair of the Scottish inquiry to be discussed with the Scottish ministers?
If you're speaking about evidence from someone in a foreign jurisdiction, that's a problem, because the chair would have no power to require that. And that actually came up in the Edinburgh tram inquiry. But what we were fortunate that we had discussions with the relevant core participants, and they agreed that their witnesses would come over from Germany.
That's why I'm asking the question, actually, because I was aware of that. And obviously in the 2005 Act, it's very clear that there is limited scope. In fact, as I understand it, even recommendations can be made to other jurisdictions. But nonetheless, some of the evidence may actually be quite relevant to the public inquiry. And it's just what process can be used to open that up.
I think the only, we thought about this quite hard, long and hard, and I reached the conclusion that the only solution was to have a discussion with the relevant core participant and to persuade them that it was in their interests for their witnesses from Germany to come and give evidence. The alternative would be that I would have commented in the report that we had made that request of the core participants and they had failed, they had refused, and that would be the sanction, particularly for a major company which is hoping to get contracts in the future.
That's very helpful, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Michelle, to follow by Craig.
Good morning. Thank you for joining us. Just finishing off a couple of things there. In terms of, I think it was yourself, Lord Hardy, who said that it was up to the chair to go back to the Scottish Government if they were seeking an augmentation of the terms of reference. There was one of the inquiries that's currently underway. We saw quite an intensive media campaign by one of the lawyers, rather than the chair pressing the Scottish Government for an augmentation of terms of reference. Is that unusual in your experience?
Well, I would think it is unusual for a professional person to do that when the chair had the necessary ability to do that. Okay. I think ultimately the chair may well have approached the government.
Okay, well, I'm not certain about that. And just finishing off on the discussion about maximisation, and again, interested disclosure, I once ran a small business in primary research with Roger Mullen, who gave evidence about maximisation, but I read his submission with interest as well. But one thing that is implicit rather than explicit is around the power balance in going through this process of giving people the right to respond. Inevitably, I suspect that the people who have that right will have deeper pockets. They may be representative companies. Is that something that has ever been considered in terms of power balance around maximisation?
I don't think so. The people that received letters, in my case, some of them were institutions, but some were individuals who were not legally represented, as far as I know. Well, they weren't legally represented. They weren't core participants, and they may well have sought legal representation privately. Mm. So, if you're looking at power balance for an individual to come back is quite an exercise, and that's also part of the reason why you've got to give them sufficient time to respond.
Okay, but the main... Sorry.
I don't think that's an issue that's specific to warning letters, though. Either the warning letters will come out and there's nothing further to add, and in a lot of cases there's actually nothing further to add and people come back and repeat. But those witnesses will already have prepared their submissions and decisions will have been made whether they get legally funded representation or not, and organisations who can afford to do so without will not have representation. So when those letters are required, they're required as part of the overall gathering of the evidence. So the question relates to the whole process of whether somebody should have legal representation or not. Okay. It's not creating an additional as such.
Okay. I wanted to go back to kind of where we started. And if you don't mind me saying, Lord Hardy, I had a sort of little titter to myself when you were making the point, and quite reasonably, about nobody knows, in effect, the scope of this piece of work. And I think and you may be have a better recollection than me, but I distinctly seem to think I remember the tram inquiry itself, the people undertaking that say, frankly, we didn't know how much uncertainty and complexity there was once they started digging underground. And to this to me talks to the need for a proper comprehensive approach, because these are, after all, and it's not the right terminology because it tends to be business focused, but they're projects in that they have a defined start and end, and all the things we've talked about, terms of reference, scope, purpose, budget, all of these things you could consider in that project. And last week when Professor Cameron was in front of us, I asked him, is there any other arena that you've dealt with through the source of your career where there's no cost control, the terms of reference don't ordinarily contain a budget, there's no stage gates or phasing in the inquiry, there's no active monitoring? Have you ever come across that in your career? And he said, no, I haven't. And I just wondered, are we getting a bit confused between the fact that there's the uncertainty and complexity, which I fully accept, that public inquiries in of themselves are the only type of project in any public sector work or in any sort of private business work that wouldn't adopt a project methodology? And perhaps this is a better one for yourself, Dr. Ayrton, first. Are there really compelling reasons why we wouldn't put some proper methodology in place?
No. No, there should be. And it's those two areas. There should be that centre. So there is Cabinet Office guidance that goes back to 2012 that requires all UK inquiries to produce a lessons learnt report. So in terms of their processes, what they've learnt, what they would recommend to inquiries in the future. Those almost without exception have not been produced, and those would be incredibly valuable. They need to go to a central body, they need to be analysed, and that information needs to be publicly available. Some inquiries have produced some small case studies which are actually very helpful as they produce as they go along, but they'll go into the Cabinet Office team, and I've never seen any, I don't know anyone who's actually seen those. So we need the information from every inquiry as it runs in terms of what's worked, what other inquiries would learn from it. But also we need embedded evaluation within inquiries themselves built in, because rather than just wait until the end of the inquiry and then say, well, what would you have done differently if you did it again? Well, we wouldn't have gone down that route. What you need is periodic evaluation with insight from those engaging, so from core participants and various categories of witnesses, as well as counsel and everyone else. What is this inquiry, what's its aims, what is it meant to be achieving? Is it achieving that? And that feedback should go back to the chair, so it can be improved as it goes in terms of efficiency and cost effectiveness. So it can be learning and checking as it goes, and then at the end of that, the lessons learned should go to a central repository and be available to all future inquiries. So we then would get this continuous improvement of inquiries going forward. We're not getting that. What we have is we do have pockets of excellence. We do have little examples of innovation that are working really well, but they're not being gathered and disseminated. So we're losing those, and it's almost chance how each inquiry then conducts itself.
Yeah. And you're making quite clear that this is actually a UK-wide problem. Yeah. As well. I mean, we've had quite a lot of media interest in this, that perhaps this suggests it's a uniquely Scottish one, but actually it appears to be a UK-wide problem. Yeah. Okay, carrying on, I want to just explore a wee bit around the potential for conflict of interest. And this is something that I brought up with Professor Cameron last week, and he made clear that there was an active consideration of the potential for interest. And we've had several examples today where I've declared an interest in my colleague Liz Smith. We've seen examples where, you know, a solicitor may take on or prospect for a very high-profile case and then actively advocates and lobbies their best friend for a public inquiry. Now, in that particular instance, their best friend happened to be the Justice Secretary in the Scottish Government, and then a public inquiry is confirmed. And perhaps this is a question for yourself, Lord Hardy. Surely in instances like that, if there has to be at least the potential for significant and disclosable conflict of interest. Is that a usual approach that you've seen, or conflict of interest, given the very small network of relationships we've got in Scotland, but certainly consideration in Jersey, which is smaller again? Is that something that you would actively consider or would actively hope to be considered?
Well, I think that's maybe ultimately a question for Parliament. If there's a suggestion that I gather from your question, maybe some suggestion of impropriety in somebody lobbying the appropriate minister for his or her own benefit. So I think that would be ultimately an issue for the Parliamentary Commission. It's certainly conflict of interest arose in a different way in the tram inquiry, because solicitors who had appeared, who had acted for the City of Edinburgh during that inquiry, during that project, amalgamated the practice with the solicitors who had acted for the contractors. And at the preliminary hearing, I raised the question as to whether there was a conflict, but they said that their respective clients insisted on them continuing to represent, and they had Chinese walls. But the question of conflict of interest is an issue that the chair, if he's aware of it, should at least raise with the people at the inquiry, so it can be addressed. And I also indicated, I think in my note, that the excuse me, the advantage of setting up a unit at the beginning within the Justice Department was that it would avoid any conflict of interest, because conflict of interest is not almost actual conflict. It's the perception.
Indeed.
And the sponsor department, in my case, was the Department of Transport, who had been involved in so that, you know, there was. They also put up Chinese walls and kept it separate. But I was always a wee bit uneasy that there was this perception that the department who had been actively involved in the project is sponsoring it and funding the inquiry into it. So, but if it was then channeled into the Justice Department or the Courts Department, they're accustomed to dealing with litigation against the government, and that would be more apparently independent.
And so, in that case, often a question will be asked: well, who would be the beneficiary of this course of action? So, for in the example I'm giving, by calling for an increase in scope of a public inquiry, whilst at the same time representing the core participants, and therefore potentially being a significant beneficiary. Are you aware of any processes where that kind of, as you say, often it can simply be about perception, but are you aware of any processes, unless you yourself take action as chair or any other chair, but there's nothing formalised that allows for these questions to be asked, is there? No. Okay. I don't know if you've got anything to add, Dr. Ireton.
Not specifically.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Craig, to be followed by John.
Thank you, Kevin. Good morning. Just in relation to cost control, Lord Hardy, you've obviously set out your concerns that imposing cost controls or a time frame risks the independence of the inquiry. Setting that to one side, what spending controls do you think would be necessary to uphold public confidence in relation to the public purse, whilst maintaining the independence of the chair? In practical terms, what could be done in terms of cost control?
Well, I think what happens at the moment is that there are discussions between the Secretariat and the sponsor department at the outset, and there's an annual budget fixed and a timescale of what you hope to achieve in that year for that. And then that's reviewed. It's reviewed within the year. I think there are monthly reports of expenditure and where we are, basically. And then the next year, another budget's adjusted. Now, clearly, that has the risk of cost creep, because unless the department is actually exercising some significant control over the budget and asking the Secretariat sufficient questions, it would then come back to me, obviously. But I wasn't aware of any serious challenge of our budget or of our timescale.
In his evidence, John Sturrock, KC, suggests that some sort of oversight and support for public inquiries might be necessary. And he says the balance between chair independence from external interference and value for public money is a delicate one. So there's potential for some kind of oversight function there. Could that be an independent organisation, for example, Audit Scotland, or somebody independent of government, but who maintains reference to the public purse?
Yes, I mean, I think if you are going to have oversight, it should be somebody who's independent, such as Audit Scotland.
Obviously, the other element in relation to value for taxpayers' money is what's actually done with the report. And I think in your submission to us, you argue that effectively the reports can sit on a minister's desk gathering dust. What could be done in future, either by Parliament or by an external body, to ensure that the lessons that should be learned are actually acted upon?
Well, I think the obvious responsibility of that is Parliament. The Parliament should hold the executive to account and say, you know, we've seen that the report in Edinburgh Town Inquiry has been submitted. There are so many recommendations. What is the government's response to each of these recommendations? And keep on about that. And then once you know that the government accept that some of the recommendations appear to be well-founded, if they do, then it's for MSPs to say to the government, well, what are you going to do about it? And keep up the pressure, because unless that happens, they'll be ignored. Because even the recommendations in the past in the UK inquiries that have been accepted are not necessarily implemented. They say, oh, we don't have the time for legislation or what have you. But it's up to MSPs, I think, to...
Yeah. Dr. Orton, are other international examples of where governments have put in place a better mechanism to make sure that lessons are learned and then implemented?
Yes, there is. We're looking at two things here. There's oversight, but with oversight you also need scrutiny, because if you just have an oversight mechanism, it is not uncommon for there to be slightly inaccurate or exaggerated recording in terms of implementation. So you need scrutiny. So, for example, in Australia, and this does seem to be working well, certain royal commissions and public inquiries, and their royal commissions are pretty much the same as our statutory inquiries. As part of their recommendations, they have recommended the appointment of an implementation monitor, and sometimes they might name the implementation monitor, sometimes they might recommend that an implementation monitor is appointed. And it is their role to scrutinise the implementation, and those are subject specialists who understand, and this is a proper evidence-based scrutiny of implementation, and they report directly back to Parliament. So then everybody has an accurate oversight of the situation in terms of implementation. Another thing that I'm not aware of this working fully well, but it is in parts in some other jurisdictions, and it seems such a simple, obvious thing to do. There should be a central resource that anyone can go to. So there should be a website that you should be able to go to and see what inquiries have there been in Scotland, which ones are currently operating, links to their websites, when they're completed, their reports, the response, and updates on implementation. Because there's no transparency. So we need scrutiny by the public, by the people that have campaigned for the inquiries in the first place, by the media. But it all disappears behind closed doors at that stage, and it's very difficult then for anybody to understand what's happened in terms of implementation and has it been followed through.
Thank you. And just finally, just to go back on perhaps the role of the legal sector in respect of cost control and mission creep and so on and so forth. Roger Mullen, in his submission to us, says this. He says the unintended consequences of this is that individuals and legal firms paid on the basis of their time involved in an inquiry have no incentive to be as efficient as possible and indeed will get rewarded from the public purse by maximising their time involved. Is there a risk, Lord Hardy, based on your experience, that the fact that the whole mechanism is built up, that people are paid on a daily basis, means that there is some incentive for this to slide?
Well, the chair of the inquiry should take steps to avoid that. The chair should... as is said in other responses, this is an inquisitorial approach. So it's not within the control of lawyers acting for core participants. It's within the control of the chair to say, I'm only interested in evidence of this type, and it's up to others to comply with those decisions. And also, it's for the chair to fix strict timetables for hearings and what have you, so that they're not allowed to extend beyond the allocation. There are various ways of doing that. I've referred to the decision not to allow opening speeches, but also you don't allow cross-examination, because that's an adversarial approach. You do, of course, respect the right of core participants to participate meaningfully, but what I did was I said, in advance of a hearing, in advance of a witness appearing, several days in advance, you have to give notice of questions that you, as a core participant, want asked of this witness, even if that witness was their witness. And the questions would then come to me, and they would be passed to counsel for the inquiry. And I would say, well, I'm interested in this question, I'm not interested in that question. And counsel to the inquiry would then take upon himself the responsibility of asking that question. And it was only in very exceptional circumstances that we allowed counsel for a core participant to ask questions. And that was if it was a complicated issue. And we thought it was going to be quicker for them to ask 2 or 3 questions. So the chair has the power and the ability to control time spent by lawyers on the inquiry, at least the public hearings. And when it came to closing submissions, I ordered or gave a direction that they had to be in written form, and each core participant was allowed no more than a morning or an afternoon to elaborate on what had been weeks of evidence.
Thank you. Finally, just Dr. Urton in her submission states that one of the core elements of cost effectiveness is transparent cost and timetable management. And Lord Hardy, if you forgive me for just asking a question that relates to you personally, Transport Scotland were very resistant to what you were paid for chairing the inquiry going into the public domain. Were you consulted by them on that issue, and do you think that meets the requirement that Dr. Urton has put in there, which was transparent cost management, because it shouldn't have to have gone to the Information Commissioner before that information about public purse monies being used enters the public domain? Yes,
I was consulted about it, and I did indicate that I thought it was unreasonable, but I've accepted the position that it's in the public domain, and it should be in the public domain.
But did I hear correctly, you thought it was unreasonable that they didn't release it, or that it was unreasonable that it was released?
No, I thought at one point it was unreasonable it was released, because I anticipated that it would result, or wrongly anticipated, that it would result in the media attending at my house and pestering us, but they didn't do that.
But would that have been good reason enough not to have put that important information into the public domain?
Well, without going into my personal circumstances, yes, because of health and other issues.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. John, to be followed by Michael.
Thanks very much, Convener. Dr. Ayrton, you say there's a strong case for greater use of shorter focused statutory inquiries which deliver thematic learning and policy recommendations within 12 to 24 months. That sounds quite positive to me. Is that actually possible?
Yes, because that is done in other jurisdictions. So that comes back to the point about deciding what you want an inquiry to do. If you convene the inquiry and the terms of reference are focused on that policy type inquiry, the thematic learning, the checks and balances and so forth, and you narrow it to that, you can have a quicker, cheaper inquiry. if you're going to make it very broad and cover all aspects, you're inevitably going to get an expensive, lengthy inquiry.
Okay, so Lord Hardy, if you were given, say, 24 months to do the best you could for either the tram inquiry or any inquiry, would that not be a better way of doing things?
I wouldn't accept the challenge. I would not.
You wouldn't do it?
I wouldn't do the inquiry. Yeah. If I'm not able to do a proper job, then I would not be willing to undertake a job that I felt was less than satisfactory, and I would leave that for someone else.
Can I just clarify?
Okay.
I wasn't suggesting that you could take an inquiry and then put a 2-year limit on it.
Right.
So it would be a different inquiry.
Yes.
Altogether. So you have to make sure that the task that is being set for the inquiry can be done properly, thoroughly and well within the timescale, which means inevitably you've got to make the task much smaller and more focused.
Yes. Okay, no, that's fair enough. I mean, Lord Hardy used the word proper there, and I just wonder, other professions, I mean, a GP has to assess somebody in 10 minutes. Now, I accept that is far too short. Accountants, I'm an accountant, I have to say, have to audit a company within, say, 9 months. Most professions, and other jobs as well, the cleaner for this room, have a time limit and are expected to produce the best they can, not a perfect result, but the best they can within that time limit. Would that not be a better model?
No, the cleaner of this room knows what he or she has to do. He or she can weigh up the size of the room, the number of surfaces that you cleaned, the floor and what have you, and would no doubt give you a quote on that basis. What I'm saying is that in particular types of inquiry, I accept that there are some inquiries which can be dealt with very quickly, and John Sturrock gave an example of a situation in Highland which would have been inappropriate to have had a judge-led inquiry into. But if you're talking about an inquiry which involves looking at contract documents and several hundred pages, if you're talking about looking at the possibility of 3 million documents whittled down to 3 million, and if you're talking about getting statements from 50 or 100 witnesses, then clearly it would not be professional for me, in my view, to say that I would provide an investigation into that and a report within 2 years.
But, I mean, again, not to labour the point too much, but I mean, other professions, you know, accountants, when they look at a business, if they're new auditors, it's completely unknown to them. They focus in on the risk. They look at the areas where there's likely to be a problem. So they don't just go over all the 3 million documents, which I'm sure most companies would have. And I mean, if we look at like the COVID inquiry, I mean, all of us lived through it. We know 95% of what happened. Should they not just be focusing in on the 5% that we don't know what happened? Well,
I don't know what the COVID inquiry is, what its terms of reference are, or what it's doing. Clearly, if you're going to do it, I think to come back to the point, it's the terms of reference that determine what is required. The government decided what they wanted, and to satisfy that, one has to do a proper job. And it's all very well making comparisons. Lawyers equally are able to quote for clients on the basis of assessing what's required. But they're basing it on their experience of having done something similar with a house sale, a company's sale or purchase. But in an inquiry, you're in the dark, and the the terms of reference are the first that you know. And if somebody said to you at that stage, how much is it going to cost? How long is it going to be? Well, you'd be dishonest if you said it'll be 3 years or it'll be 4 years.
I mean, could you limit the number of witnesses or core participants? Just say, well, there's going to be 10 of them and we'll just take the 10 best?
But then do what? Then say to somebody who has a legitimate interest, I'm sorry, you're not allowed to be part of this inquiry. You'd be in the court of session quicker than you could say Jack Robinson.
I mean, this committee carries out inquiries, but we invite anybody to send written information, but we only invite 2 of you this morning and 3 later on to actually come to us. Is that not reasonable?
Well, it is reasonable for this committee, but it's not reasonable in the context of a public inquiry.
But is that because we've got a wrong idea of public inquiries, that they're too legal, they're too much like courts?
No, they're not too much like courts, because, as has been said, it's inquisitorial, and the chair can control the actions of the various core participants by not allowing them to ask questions other than through counsel to the inquiry. And they're not too legal. It depends on the subject matter. The subject matter here was a question of a public scandal, of a public contract which had gone completely astray. And I may say it's not the only public contract that's gone astray, but what the government of the day wanted was to find out what had happened and why and what could be done in the future. And I may say, if you've read the report, I was appalled at some of the evidence that I heard of officials misleading councillors. I never dreamed, and if somebody had said to me at the outset, this might involve public officials deliberately changing reports or telling councillors as a result of a business case that this was a fixed price contract. If somebody had said to me, this is what we're talking about, people misleading the elected body, I would have said, you're talking nonsense.
Okay. Dr. Arton, is it too legal, the same question?
Yes, and I won't talk about the specifics of inquiries, but so you need to, I think there are certainly examples where they are too legalistic and there are too many lawyers involved. When you have powers of compulsion, if you have a statutory inquiry, you need to allow some element of legal representation. You need to ensure fairness. You need people who are exposed to potential future liability, damage to their reputation, and so forth. They need legal advice. And where necessary, that will be funded.
Can I just push you on that point?
Yes.
Because does that not just lead to people hiding things? I mean, if we're wanting people to be frank and open and say why they made decisions, do the lawyers not just curtail that?
Okay, it's all about balance. When we had the predecessor to the 2005 Act, so the UK-wide, the 21 Act, had powers of compulsion with no provision to allow for legal representation. And there were some very extreme examples of reputations being destroyed and damage to people who had been compelled to give evidence on oath without any form of legal protection. And there are common law duties of fairness. So it is appropriate that there is an involvement of legal representation, legal representatives. Also, the role of core participants is to assist the inquiry in doing its job. They are not parties to the process, they are to assist the inquiry. But a lot of those will need legal assistance to advise them on the process. It's an unusual process and deal with the quantity and so forth. However, not everybody, well, nobody has an entitlement to be a core participant, and some inquiries have done a better job than others in terms of controlling the number of core participants and legal representation, because that is a huge cost of an inquiry. So there's 2 kinds of lawyers involved in an inquiry: those that work for the inquiry, the solicitor to the inquiry, counsel to the inquiry, and then those that represent core participants and witnesses. And over time, there have been an awful lot of lawyers involved, and that can make the whole process very legalistic, and the inquiry can lose its focus in terms of driving the inquisitorial system, and it can become a bit more sort of just taking one side's position and putting it to the other and more like a court. So there is definitely scope in terms of learning best practice from those who have appointed less core participants. That doesn't mean they can't be witnesses, it doesn't mean they can't assist the inquiry, but you don't have to make everybody a core participant if they have an interest in the outcome of the inquiry and so forth. So yes, there are things that can be done.
Okay.
Can I add to that,
Yes.
at the trial inquiry, I refused 2 applications to be core participants because I wasn't satisfied that they would advance the inquiry.
Well, that's helpful. Thank you. Final area I wanted to kind of touch on, maybe yourself, Dr. Arton. I mean, are people generally satisfied after public inquiries? And I realise there's a lot of different bodies involved, but if we say like the victims or the families of victims, that kind of thing, or do we even know if that's the case, if they're satisfied?
It depends on the inquiry. It depends on how well it has been communicated, what the purpose of the inquiry is, how well expectations have been managed, and you need to accept there will always be people who are not satisfied with the outcome of an inquiry, because there will always be some that want a broader inquiry and a more detailed inquiry, or an inquiry that has a different focus and so forth. But there are examples where you can compare inquiries here and inquiries in other jurisdictions on the same topic, where I'm thinking of an example in Australia where the participants were more satisfied with that inquiry. They took longer at the beginning to engage with the participants, for everybody to understand the purpose of the inquiry, so everyone was pulling in the same direction, and they managed that better than our equivalent, where that investment wasn't made at the beginning and nobody was quite in agreement what the purpose of the inquiry was for and whether or not it achieved it at the end.
Okay, that's very helpful. Thanks so much. Thanks, Convener.
Thank you, Michael.
Thanks, Convener. Thank you for all your evidence so far. It's been invaluable, I think, to the committee. I'm going to touch, first of all, on areas of the appointment of a chair. Lord Hardy, so my questions will come to you in that regard. I mean, your CV is one of many decades of distinguished service in Scottish public life. If somebody had said to you, following on from Mr Mason, this inquiry will take up 9 years of your professional life, would you have said yes?
I think I would have preferred to have spent my time with my grandchildren.
Indeed. And I suppose that probably, and one of the areas, now I want to share the declaration with Liz Smith in terms of my involvement around the Eljamel inquiry. I have constituents that are involved in that regards and being in conversations with ministers about the setting up of that inquiry. And some of the delays in the setting up of the inquiries are about finding a chair, for waiting for the Lord President to find somebody of standing such as yourself to take that on. Is there not a risk that, for instance, 9-year inquiries result in more people saying, I would love to, but no thanks, I'd like to spend the time with my grandchildren?
Well, that's for others to decide, but certainly if anybody asked me now even to do a 1-year inquiry, I think I would just go back to the grandchildren.
Yeah, and that, I suppose, then is part of the issue about trying to make, I suppose, on Dr Ayrton's position around something that feels, and I understand the tensions that are involved in this around the freedom of the inquiry, and you're a stout defender in your evidence this morning of the need for judges to be able to be led by the evidence as it's presented.
I think, could I just interrupt? I mean, I'm speaking from the perspective of a judge-led inquiry, but I agree with Dr Ayrton that not all inquiries have to be judge-led, just in case anyone's got that impression from me.
Of course, that is useful, I think. But there is there seems to be a preponderance or almost a monopoly at the moment in terms of these inquiries that are being set up in Scotland, that they are judge-led. I mean, do you think, so you're saying that you think that other options are available? Could you speculate as to why it is the case?
I think it's horses for courses. I mean, I'm aware of a very good friend of mine in the Lodge, Lord Lamming, who, as Herbert Lamming, was Director of Social Work, and he chaired an inquiry into Victoria Climate death, a child who had been known to the social work department, and sadly, as happens far all too often, she was ultimately murdered by her relatives. And he was the chair of that inquiry, and I think that was appropriate because, as a former director of social work in one area, he had the expertise to ask social workers and to deal with social workers as to why they didn't take the child into care, as to what checks they made for the care. So there are inquiries where it's appropriate that other people with appropriate experience should chair the inquiry.
Are you aware, through other conversations of other members of the judiciary who have turned down offers or requests on the basis of how long it might take?
No, I'm not. I'm not
directly.
No.
Okay. And I suppose you described the trams. You said a public scandal. You called it that led to the trams inquiry. I suppose part of the fallout of your own inquiry has been perhaps people looking at it and saying, well, part of the issue in the first instance was huge delays, cost overruns, and then people look at the inquiry and say, that has gone on for 9 years, huge delays, cost overruns. Does that undermine the credibility slightly? Is that something you were concerned about?
Well, I was always concerned about views expressed about the time it was taking, but there was really nothing else that could be done, given the challenges that we faced.
Yeah. And you identified in the written evidence that there were part of the restrictions was that you were not able to command evidence from particularly commercial firms, and they wouldn't provide you with evidence. Would it have been better if it been a full statutory powered inquiry from the outset?
Yes, I think so. I mean, to begin with, it wasn't just companies. The First Minister reassured Parliament that I think it was the Minister for Veterans had liaised with the City of Edinburgh, who had assured them of their total support. But the reality was that they couldn't do that because of the Data Protection Act. And the only way around that was to have statutory powers to require the City of Edinburgh to give me the data about former employees who could then pursue and interview. Even when we did that, it was quite difficult to get hold of them sometimes.
Dr. Ayrton, you set out your, I suppose, the kind of taxonomy of forensic policy, truth-telling. Have you looked at the issues of commercial interests within this, and where a firm or there's a set of organisations that may refuse to give evidence in the full due to commercial interests that they may have in protecting their firms? Do those require statutory powers?
Yes, you could have statutory powers in all three types. Yes, statutory powers are important. They're not always used. Often it is sufficient for an inquiry to have those powers, and actually they're quite infrequently used. But knowing those powers are there, it's not always the right thing. I could give you examples of inquiries that have worked better being non-statutory, and others that have been better being statutory, depending on the subject matter and the nature and so forth. But yes, it's often important. And I think in terms of perception in the public, having public inquiries that have statutory powers to compel, we do have this perception currently that they are seen as the gold standard or the more serious inquiry because they can compel people to give evidence. Okay, so my final area then for yourself, Dr. Ayrton, is around this tension between the freedom of an inquiry and public trust, and that were it to be viewed that it was an inquiry that had a more limited remit within your taxonomy particularly, and then how that relates to the view of victims or related parties and the public more generally. Are there other things that could be done to build public trust around a more
limited form of inquiry?
Yes, it's about public understanding. So this focus I'm talking about is not a theoretical, it is used in other jurisdictions and it works. So, you know, but the difference there is the context. For various reasons, as have drifted, and we've allowed expectations of inquiries to be huge, that they will deliver everything. Where everything else has failed, an inquiry will come in and solve everything. And a public inquiry is not the solution to something. It is convened to inform the government to address the matter of public concern. And there's poor understanding around that. The narrative, often inquiries, I'm talking UK-wide, are announced, and if you look at the terms of reference, it can clear that they're envisaging quite a policy systemic looking at the checks and balances. But then at the same time, someone will make a statement, we will leave no stone unturned, we will give justice to the survivors and the bereaved. And that language is telling them it's going to be a full forensic inquiry. So often inquiries are just put off track before they even start because of the narrative. Debates within Parliament and MPs and so forth. If the language used reflects we need a public inquiry for justice, for the individuals, to get answers to everything, that is what is muddying the waters. So I think improving it, the efficiency and the length and so forth, is at every step of the inquiry. It is from the focus of the minister when they're setting the terms of reference. It's from the narrative that goes on around. It's from what the media is saying. It's public education. It's induction for the chair so they understand the nature of the process they're involved with. The legal representatives, we haven't talked about it, but that push sometimes to come to it as if it's sort of a preparation for future litigation. They need to manage the expectations. Right through to government departments need to accept that they need to actively engage with a public inquiry, not sit back and wait and see what happens, because that is adding cost and a huge delay to inquiries as well. And then the government needs to recognise they convene the inquiry not to solve everything, but to provide what they need in order to address that matter of public concern. So it's every step of the way, and it's the narrative and it's public education and education of everybody involved at every stage.
Okay, thank you. We've just got a supplementary question from Michelle.
It's just a tiny wee question to help build my own knowledge. I've read the criteria that determines what is a core participant, but do core participants pick their own lawyer, or do they have one allocated to them where the inquiry may be extended, or say the Scottish COVID inquiry is linked into the UK one? How does that work with the lawyers?
So they may already have legal representatives. The inquiry recognises legal representatives. They can have their own lawyers. It's when they get involved in funding and core participants and so forth. But inquiries can make a decision that there will be joint representation in terms of who's recognised as the legal representative. So numbers can be limited in that way. So the chair does have an involvement in that.
Right. So that's what I just wanted to get at. There could exist a situation where the chair would determine who the lawyer was to represent the core participants. And I've already pointed out that who are core participants is subjected to criteria. But I think you've confirmed that for me. Okay, thank you.
Yes, I think, sorry if I may come back on that. It's right, if there are several court participants and the chair considered that their interests could be dealt with as a unit, then he would decide, or she would decide, that there should be representation by one person. But whether the chair would actually choose which lawyer is another matter, because each of them might have their own lawyer. And I think the prudent thing for the chair would be to say, well, you three core participants are to be held together. It's up to you to decide who your representative, and they should decide that rather than have somebody forced upon them that they maybe didn't want.
Okay. Thank you.
To clarify, what I was saying is if that decision has been made, the chair can then refuse to allow someone just because they want another legal representative. They can say, no, that is the legal representative for this group of core participants.
Right, okay. And I think it was worthwhile confirming that, because that's a useful detail. Thank you very much.
That was helpful. Okay, that's concluded our questions for this panel. I'm just wondering if there are any final points either of you would wish to make at this juncture. Okay, well, thank you very much for your evidence. We have another panel, so we'll call a 5-minute natural break and then we will reconvene. Thank you very much for your evidence this morning. Very helpful.